The latest news, national issues, the political scene, and conversations with prominent personalities. All these firsthand at the forefront. Good morning. I am Attorney Karen Jimeno. Former President Rodrigo Duterte attended yesterday the grueling 11th hearing of the Congress quadcom for the bloody war on drugs during his administration. He reiterated what he said in the Senate last month, that he is taking full responsibility for the war on drugs. He also welcomed the filing of cases against him in local courts and even dared the International Criminal Court to begin its probe on his war on drugs immediately. Is the former president really ready to face the ICC? Joining us this morning is one of the representatives of Congress who interrogated President Duterte last night, Congresswoman Gerville Luistro. Thank you so much, Congresswoman Gerville.
Thank you, Attorney Karen, and thank you for having me again for the second time.
Siguro wala ka pong tulog, no? Kasi I was watching the quadcom hearing until it ended, and it ended almost midnight.
Almost midnight. Yes, kulang sa tulog, and like the rest of the people who attended the quadcom hearing, the 11th quadcom hearing last night.
And Congresswoman Gerville, why did it last that long? Isn't there a procedure? Because I noticed a lot of the questions from other congressmen were also repetitive. Is there a process within the committee wherein you can kind of coordinate as to what questions will be asked so that you can consolidate all the questions and make the hearing more efficient?
Why that long? Perhaps we need to understand that quadcom is composed of 4 committees, and as I have shared before, narito ang dangerous drugs under the leadership of Chairman Barbers, public accounts under the leadership of Chairman Caraps Paduano. We also have public order headed by Congressman Dan Fernandez, Chairman Fernandez, and of course the Human Rights Committee headed by Chairman Abante.
So do you know how many congressmen and women questioned the president yesterday?
I think we're about 10 plus the chairman, so around 15 members of the quadcom who raised questions to the former President Karen.
And Congresswoman Gerville, for a lot of those who watch the hearings, we want to understand, when we look at the Constitution, the role of Congress is to legislate. So all the hearings are in aid of legislation. But the tone of the questioning borders sometimes on interrogation, and it almost sounds like an investigation. So when you invited, your quadcom invited former President Duterte, what was the invitation to him as a resource person?
Everybody is being invited as a resource person because, tama ka dun, Karen, this is an inquiry in aid of legislation. This is our main purpose, to come up with legislations which will enhance the existing ones or will lead to legislating new ones, no? Kaya lang, we will not be able to come up with these legislations unless we know the facts in depth. Kaya we need really to dig deeper what really went wrong. Saan ba nanggaling yung mga infractions and what legislative measures should be necessary to avoid the recurrence of these infractions. I wish to share, Karen, that with respect to the EJK, we have passed the bill already which defines extrajudicial killing as a heinous crime. And by heinous crime, it means that that would be a no-bail offense, and this will be considered as a capital offense punishable by the maximum penalty.
But EJK also amounts to murder. Is this not covered under our existing laws, under the revised penal code?
I understand that this, under the present law, is considered as murder under the revised penal code. But considering the huge number of victims of extrajudicial killing, that it cannot be committed by one person alone, that there has to be somebody which should act as the principal by inducement, and it should be committed by somebody who has the power and in authority. We really needed to define EJK as a new law under this new bill, Attorney Karen.
And in that bill, does it also visualize other circumstances? Not just, for example, war on drugs, but for example, extrajudicial killings because you're trying to silence freedom of expression or the right to association. So for those that, for example, you have an authoritarian regime, something similar to martial law, would that also apply?
I believe so, but what is important, Attorney, by EJK, it means that we disregarded the fundamental requirement of due process, which is notice and hearing. Kahapon, kagabi, no, naririnig natin yung former president, he kept on narrating stories about pinatay niya, basta kriminal, papatayin niya. But I wish to emphasize, kahit kriminal pa yan, kahit convicted pa yan, we have no right to execute these people. This is a civilized society. We submit to the rule of law. Dapat merong notice, dapat merong hearing, and once convicted, they should be detained and suffer from maximum penalty if that is the case. We should remember also that even death sentence is currently prohibited in our country.
Well, I understand that that's really the fundamental basis here, that there should be due process, and it's really in our constitution as well. That's why we prohibit extrajudicial killings. But in this case, is there also due process for the former president when we have Congress also asking questions, trying to pin him down when he is not the subject of a prosecution because he was invited as a resource person?
I wish to state that the quadcom is not trying to pin down the former president. We're just trying to ferret out the truth as to what really happened, especially considering that he made so many public pronouncements about kill, kill, kill during his presidency. And now that we are confronted by the huge number of victims of EJK, that is more than 31,000, I believe, Attorney Karen, we really need to find out paano dumami ng ganito ang victims ng EJK. Is there really a relation between the very bold statement of the former president to kill the drug personalities with regards to the execution in the level of the police officer that led to that number of victims of extrajudicial killing?
Based on prior hearings and other resource persons that were invited, has there been any leads as to what really caused the statistics that you mentioned yesterday? Because I was hearing the statistics you mentioned, they also included deaths of judges, deaths of mayors. So have you been able to trace what really caused these deaths?
Perhaps we need to consider first the testimony of Colonel Garma and even Colonel Leonardo, because these two, I believe, are now whistleblowers because they have testified to the existence of the Davao death squad, the extrajudicial killing, and the reward system, and ultimately the president being the author of all this, the former president. And I believe that the testimonies of these two completes or suffices the elements that we are looking for us to establish at the very least murder and at the most violation of our existing law on crime against international humanitarian law. I believe that is RA 9815, Attorney Karen.
I remember, Congresswoman Jinky, you manifested that you will be making a recommendation, the committee will be making a recommendation for the filing of cases in relation to the law that you mentioned in terms of international humanitarian law, or also perhaps as a violation of the revised penal code on murder. But is that within the ambit of a committee to do, to recommend the filing of cases? Because that normally falls under the Department of Justice.
Definitely, Attorney Karen, it is not part of the job of the Congress to file cases.
Or to recommend filing?
But we
is
can
that...
recommend the filing of cases with the proper offices or agencies. And for this to be particular is the Department of Justice. We acknowledge that our task here is to legislate. However, in the process of coming up with this legislation, we are able to establish evidence, findings, which are necessary for the filing of the necessary actions in court. And to maximize what we have gone through already, no? We normally include in our committee report the recommendations of the filing of actions, not only in court, but even administrative cases, Attorney.
And Congresswoman Jinky, when you already had those two, as you call them, whistleblowers, why did the quadcom not turn it over to the DOJ at that point for the further investigation and perhaps filing of cases? Why still proceed with quadcom?
Because as we go along with the investigation, Attorney Karen, witnesses keep on coming and coming. That's why we are prompted to invite more resource persons, although we assess also the vitality and the weight of the evidence or the testimony that they will be giving to the investigation. Certainly, the testimony of these witnesses help us get a better perspective about the law that we're coming up with and the recommendations that we need to do as part of the committee report.
Jinky, yesterday I was also listening to the portion where you were asking about a quarry in Laud and shooting range there. But I was a bit confused. Does that cover the term of former President Duterte as president or as mayor?
Actually, the extrajudicial killing happened first in Davao City during his time as mayor. At ito pong Laod Quarry na to, allegedly, ito po yung mass grave ng mga victims ng EJK. Dito po tinatapon yung mga pinapatay, allegedly, ng Davao Death Squad. And I asked the former president, alam ba niya itong Laod firing range? Because it seems to me na naka-front yung Laod firing range. Pero the allegation really is this Laod Quarry is the mass grave of the victims of EJK. And we will remember, Karen, na during the time of Senator De Lima as chairman of Committee on Human Rights, pinuntahan nila to, inimbestigahan nila to, and they were able to discover human bones, body bones. At ito po yung naging dahilan, I believe, kung bakit humarap din sa investigasyon itong may-ari ng Laod Quarry. His name is Ben Laod, who was represented during that time by Atty. Vitaliano Aguirre, whom we understand after some time during the time of the presidency of the former president, na-appoint pa na DOJ secretary.
But does this mean that we're now looking at events that also happened before President Duterte was president, meaning when he was still mayor? Is that within the scope of what the quadcom now is looking at?
We have to understand, Karen, that by extrajudicial killing, talagang ang allegation dito nag-umpisa sa Davao. That's why you keep on hearing Davao Death Squad, personalities from Davao City, the Davao template that was adopted in the national scale. Kasi ang allegations about this extrajudicial killing as a result of the war on drugs really originated from Davao. Allegedly, this was adopted in Davao, at kaya di umano ang Davao ay naging safest city to live as claimed by the former president, and later on during the time of his presidency, in-implement on a national scale. So yes, we really need to investigate even those facts, those incidents, and the circumstances which happened during his time as mayor of Davao City.
So right now, when we talk about this inquiry in aid of legislation, it covers events even prior to the president's term in 2016. But does that mean that we're also zeroing in on Rodrigo Duterte as a person? Because we're digging up even events when he was still mayor.
I believe, Karen, that when we speak about EJK, it is not material whether it happened during his time as a private citizen, during his time as a mayor, during his time as a president, because by EJK, it means you put the law into your hands. You did not submit to the rule of law. Instead of filing the cases and having these people convicted by court, ang nangyari, they summarily executed these people whom they believe are criminals, Karen.
And you mentioned earlier that there's been a bill filed now in relation to EJK as an offense. But what about the other investigations of the quadcom? What happened to Alice Guo?
Let me add, Attorney Karen, that we have filed also a bill prohibiting offshore gaming operation in the Philippines. And we have also filed a bill which allows the civil forfeiture of all the real properties illegally acquired by foreign nationals. So far, Attorney Karen, 3 bills have been filed already, and that is why we have this position that we are already coming up with our partial report, which is not customary, because what is customary is there should be one final report after the inquiry in aid of legislation. But because of the so many subject matters of this investigation, and we need to come up with our accomplishment already as we go along, nauna na po itong tatlong batas na ito, but definitely may mga kasunod pa ito. We're also planning to go to the Supreme Court for the declaration of unconstitutionality of EO 13, if you remember that, Attorney Karen. Napakalaki pong committee ng quadruple committee. In fact, some people call it as mega committee. That is why we are anticipating not only bills, but a lot of recommendations that we will be doing in relation to our investigation.
And Congresswoman Jinky, the elections are coming up in 2025. So would the committee be able to see through all of their investigations? And then with the bills that are being filed, if there might be changes in district representatives, do you think that this specific makeup of the Quadcom committee can see through everything that it has initiated?
I hope that we will be able to come up with our final committee report before the 2025 election. I hope that we really can wind up the inquiry in aid of legislation by coming up with all the necessary bills and all the necessary recommendations. Because you are correct, Attorney Karen, there will be changes with respect to the personalities inside Quadcom, members of the Quadcom. Because initially, 4 of us, I believe, are last termer, or if not last termer, will be running for other positions. For one, Chairman Fernandez is running for Governor of Laguna, and Congressman Pimentel is running also for Governor of Surigao. And then I believe the Chairman Ace is last term, and there's another one. There's another one who will be ending his term as well.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Jinky. We'll be right back, and just stay here. But when we return, we'll have Attorney Kristina Conti with us when At the Forefront returns. Welcome back at the Forefront. And now joining Congresswoman Jinky Bitrix is the Secretary General of the National Union of People's Lawyers-NCR, Attorney Maria Kristina Conti. Good morning, Attorney Chrissy.
Good morning, Atty. Karen.
Isa pa tong napuyat. I saw you at the hearings yesterday. And just as a nice trivia to everyone, Attorney Chrissy used to be my student at UP Law. So, very proud of you, Attorney Chrissy. But let's talk about the hearing yesterday. So, the former president said that he's ready to face the ICC. Attorney Chrissy, you also are a consultant to the ICC. Can you explain to us what would be the procedure if that were to happen, if ICC were to come in?
Well, technically, we were part of the ICC and therefore has and does exercise jurisdiction over a particular matter under consideration. So ngayon po, right now, they're looking into crimes against humanity in the acts of murder and other inhumane acts in the context of Duterte's war on drugs. And they're determining who is most responsible. And yesterday, we heard someone say, well, I am. So moving forward, we could move into trial within, I guess, in the next few years.
But is that going to be a problem, meaning with the Philippines having withdrawn its membership from the ICC? That seems to be contradictory for them to enter at a time when we are no longer a member of the ICC, and I think procedurally the time that this investigation concluded, there's a period that has already lapsed.
Well, they're referring perhaps to an interpretation or an alternative interpretation of Article 127. This is the withdrawal provision with regard to states who would like to pull out of the ICC. But it says there that, yes, you can withdraw. If you want to, it will be effective a year after you send in your letter, one. And then two, if there is any matter under the consideration of the court already, it will continue to take cognizance or jurisdiction of the case. And it just so happened that the preliminary examination was opened before we withdrew from the ICC. So that was February 2018. We withdrew March 2018, 1 month after. 1 year after naging effective. And now they're saying that, oh, maybe you should have done the investigation prior. But for us, the preliminary examination was already a matter under the consideration of the court. And therefore, we should continue with that. Which is why the scope of the investigation actually is in particular the period when we were a member of the ICC. So it's just logical that during the time that we were a state party, we accrue obligations. So we take further that responsibility even if we have already left.
Okay, now we'll take you back to memory lane of last night. We have clips from the hearing yesterday and we want to hear your thoughts.
Suggested by Chairman Paduano na yung AMLAC mismo, since hindi naman na siya incumbent, ay pwedeng ma-access yun with the waiver. Nagsabi na yan siya na magbibigay siya ng waiver. Puro bluff yan. Kaya nga, mas maganda kung ma-draft na po natin yan ngayon para papirmahan niya yan dito. No? Para wala ng alibay.
Will the former president be okay that if we draft the waiver now, that it be signed today instead of tomorrow?
Anong kapalit, sir?
Hindi.
Sampalin ko siya sa publiko.
Hindi. Wala naman.
Hindi, ngayon na.
Wala pong ganunan.
Mr. Chairman.
I'll give you, no. Sampalin ko sa
Mr. Chairman.
Session suspended.
Session suspended.
So what is your take on that? Well, I think one, is it also appropriate to be seeking a waiver for his bank accounts, bank secrecy law, in a hearing where he is a resource person? Congresswoman Jinky.
I believe yes, because those bank accounts were shared by Senator Trillanes, the former senator, in support of his allegations that the son, Congressman Pulong, the son-in-law, Attorney Man Scarpio, and Michael Young were involved in drug trade. So, to shed light to the veracity of that allegation, I think the former president should welcome opening his accounts if indeed he's innocent about those allegations. Kaya lang, Attorney Karen, no? Initially, ang sabi ng former president, he is very willing to execute a waiver. Kaya lang later on, when he was being asked already to sign the waiver, medyo naging negative na siya. And I believe this is not the only inconsistency which happened last night. With respect to taking accountability, medyo kumakambyo din siya when being confronted by the individual incidents, Attorney Karen. So natapos yung hearing natin kagabi without the waiver being signed.
But here's a question as well. Why is Senator Trillanes bringing up bank accounts in relation to cases he filed against Paulo Duterte and Mans Carpio when the topic is EJK?
Yes. He was able to share last night na ang mga final niyang kaso, I believe, is plunder. No? So this will be part of his allegations of plunder. At kung bakit nagkaroon ng perang ganito, that's part of the proceeds of the illegal drug trade. So dun pumasok sa dangerous drugs operation, kung bakit naging part siya ng investigation. However, we have to consider also na yung plunder na final na is no longer connected with the subject matter of the investigation last night.
Okay,
Attorney
so
Karen.
this is also not the forum to continue discussing
If
these
it is
cases.
about plunder, because if we will be focusing on plunder, that would mean amassing a huge amount of money from an illegal transaction. But if we will be focusing on dangerous drug trade, the illegal drug trade, then I believe that those bank accounts is still are proper subject matters of this investigation.
What are your thoughts, Attorney Chrissy? Is this anything of interest to you? You represent families of victims of human rights violations. What are your thoughts on this issue?
Well, it's really very interesting for us because it looks into the why. Kasi it's hard for us to accept that, well, one day Duterte ordered people to kill, and then it happened. So apparently, there's a whole scheme behind it. And from what we've discovered so this is a quadcom investigation, so there are several other topics. And it turns out that there's a lot of money behind the killings. Of course, that's what we were looking at. Initially, from the point of view of victims, we thought that the sort of reward money and then the quota comes from, government policy. Because Tokhan came from a government policy, from a document. There is actually a document called Operation Lawmen that gives rewards to those who can give information about drugs operations. But we thought it should be checked with COA. But then we thought that's too small for all these killings. And it turns out that you had all this drug trade that was being protected, and then the POGO operations that was also funding and perhaps laundering the money through this killings.
But
and
these
the
are
reward
all
system.
right now being looked into. What about having solid evidence? Have we found any solid evidence really linking all of these?
I believe, Attorney Karen, that we have reasonable amount of evidence in establishing those separate issues which are being investigated by Quadcom. However, the missing evidence right now is how to connect these four separate issues with one another, which is the very reason why the Quadcom was created. I wish to go back to the investigation prior to Quadcom, Attorney Karen. I have shared this before. We observe commonalities of issues, commonalities of circumstances, and commonality of personalities. Reason why we created Quadcom, so we can investigate all these four issues all together. But yes, I acknowledge that we are challenged as to the connection of these four issues, but with respect to establishing the violations that were committed in relation to these four issues, I believe that we have reasonable amount of evidence already.
Okay, and now let's look at another clip from yesterday's hearing in relation to Congressman Dan Fernandez.
Before that, we'd like to acknowledge the presence of Vice President Sara Duterte.
Okay, so they showed a different clip. So this relates to the presence of Vice President Sara Duterte. I think a lot of people were surprised that she appeared at the Quadcom. How significant was the presence of the Vice President?
Ako, Attorney Karen, I'm not surprised.
You're not surprised?
Yes, kasi kung ako yung tatayo sa sitwasyon niya, I would really come to support my father. No? And I acknowledge her effort of showing up last night and being just around to provide support to President Duterte. However, isa lang po ang aking observation doon. Kasi she's not attending the hearings on good governance. And then she was not invited for the yesterday's hearing, but she showed up and she stayed until 12 midnight. So I hope yung kanyang presence na kino-contribute for quadcom, she can contribute also in the Committee on Good Governance, where the budget utilization of OVP and DepEd are being investigated, to provide her also ample opportunity to shed light about the issues which are being raised.
Okay, and now let's look at the next clip.
The PNP chief said that numbers remind us that the impact of the anti-drug campaign was deeply felt by our police force as well. He said there is no official record that these commitments were fully realized.
I was not asked even for a minute
So,
na
Mr.
tumulong and for what a particular purpose. Then I will now make this promise. Paghanap ako, meron akong 1 million. Hindi ako kung meron million lang, but I'll raise a fund para tulungan yung mga pulis.
Mr. President,
And I will personally appear in court. Ako mismo ang
Mr.
mag-defense counsel nila.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. President,
Why do you think former President Duterte is very determined to protect the police, even if he's no longer the incumbent president?
Well, it's for his self-interest. Because if the police suddenly say that they killed people upon his orders, it's him on the line. Remember that there are two types of crimes here: murders, which were committed directly by the police officers, and then crimes against humanity, where he is being charged as someone who ordered, encouraged, tolerated the killings. And so it's to his self-interest. But I really doubt this statement. I already talked about it yesterday, because we actually, the NUPL-NCR, filed charges against 4 police officers in Caloocan and secured a conviction. And I can see the plight of these 4 police officers who had to secure counsel, private counsel, at their own expense, when actually we charged 20 police officers in 2018. And these police officers in the beginning were not answering the charges because they had no counsel. They didn't know what to do. And this was at the height of the time that Duterte was saying, "Ako bahala sa inyo, walang mangyayari sa inyo." But when the papers came in, and the ombudsman was ready to rule on the papers that we had submitted. We already submitted our position paper and moved to resolve the case. We heard nothing from the police officers. That's when I think they realized that it's not true on the ground. He won't be giving the money, or he won't be giving the lawyers. So let's see moving forward, but his promise was as early as 2016. In 2018, that did not materialize.
Okay, and a lot of people were watching yesterday's quadcom hearing, and some were commenting that former President Duterte stood there by himself while he was being questioned, and some were using the word attacked by so many congressmen and women. And it made him look like the hero in Congress as the anti-hero. And you know, Filipinos usually sympathize with the underdog. So what is your take on that? But before you answer that question, we'll have to take a short break. At the Forefront, we'll be right back. Welcome back at the Forefront. And Congresswoman Jinky, Attorney Chrissy, some people were commenting yesterday that former President Duterte appeared to be taking all attackers by himself. And it made him look like a hero and the people in Congress as the anti-hero. What's your take on that?
Attorney Karen, I believe that it is a common knowledge that he's the one who launched the war on drugs. And that the war on drugs is the reason why there's such a thing as extrajudicial killing. So I think we are justified in putting the former president at the quadcom to answer all the questions surrounding EJK. But it does not necessarily mean that the quadcom is attacking him. We're only wanting him to shed light as to the implementation of war on drugs and why it resulted to more than 31,000 victims of EJK.
And I'm going to pick your brains as lawyers. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I have two brilliant lawyers with me. But let's look at this from the side of in aid of legislation. Right now, we're looking at extrajudicial killings. But should the ICC come in, and as you said, Attorney Chrissy, they would have jurisdiction in your view, isn't that sufficient in terms of what we have in place to deal with extrajudicial killings? And again, we have in our law, under the revised penal code, laws on murder as well. So why do we need any additional legislation?
Well, on our
Yes,
end,
sir.
so actually, for the earlier question, I would just like to remind the public that the victims were also there. And the congressmen were representing these people in a confrontation in the first time that the policy has been challenged officially. If you look at, historically, the government has not looked into the EJK policy. This is the first time that we're looking at it. So it's very important that the questions come in from different sectors. Now, as to the ICC, I think, although we have all these laws and we have the Rome Statute, it's the implementation that's terrible. And if we need additional laws to ensure that the implementation is aided, then I would think it's important. For example, in these cases, why is it that there is very little investigation or forensic evidence to proceed with? It's because state participation is very critical in cases where the state is alleged to have committed the crimes, or state agents. And definitely they will not be investigating it. Defining extrajudicial killings as a new crime, which will limit or separate it from a murder, is important when pursuing these cases, so that we will have more convictions, if possible, or more cases at the least.
Okay, let's look at another clip from yesterday's hearing.
Second question ko, responsable kayo kasi polisiyan nyo yon. Kumbaga, tatak Duterte. Dahil polisiyan nyo rin yan, tama ba, sa Davao, nung nasa Davao pa kayo. Tama ba na tawagin po itong Davao model or Davao style, Mr. Chair?
I cannot control the semantics.
Mr. Chair, yes or no?
of the
Davao style.
Do not ask me to answer yes or no. You are not an investigator.
Mr. Chair, tayo po ay nasa investigasyon kasalukuyan,
Yes,
Mr.
but you
Chair.
are not an investigator. Why are you asking me to answer
Mr. Chair,
yes or no?
tinatanong
So is this normal to be limited as a resource person, to be limited to just answering yes or no? Because he, after all, was invited as a resource person, and he's not an accused that's under investigation, or nor is he in court.
If we will be considering that one of the purpose of this inquiry in aid of legislation is to ferret out the truth so that we can come up with basis in legislation, I believe yes, because this is a very effective line of questions which lead us to our ultimate inquiry of the very thing that we really need to elicit from the resource person. And I don't see anything wrong about asking a question answerable by yes or no.
But
After
if
all,
a resource person wants to elaborate, why should they be limited from further elaborating?
I honestly believe that after every question answerable by yes or no, resource persons are given the time to elaborate and explain.
Okay, but in this case, I think the president was being cut off and asked to just
Sometimes,
limit it.
Attorney Karen, it has to be a series of yes or no, yes or no, yes or no. And then at the end of that series, he will be given ample time. You explain. How
Okay.
do you reconcile this?
And Attorney Conti, your thoughts?
Well,
Because you're also a resource person when you
Yeah.
attend the hearings, yeah.
Fortunately, I wasn't asked yes or no questions. But yeah, this is, well, in law, we could classify these kinds of questions as like cross-examination questions, where essentially you have testimony already from the witness, because there is a lot of material. Statements from the president from when from the former president when he was in office, and then afterwards he had the Senate hearings. He was just being confronted with the documents, and he was being asked to confirm. So I think it would be valid to ask a resource person yes or no. But the thing is, in this case, he was actually allowed to explain, but then it's just that he wasn't answering yes or no, and that was crucial. Before you explain, say yes or no.
Okay. And as a last question, I'm really sad that we're out of time, but I want to ask you both. Since this is, again, supposedly investigation in aid of legislation, and Attorney Chrissy mentioned a good point in terms of always having implementation as the problem. In the Philippines, you have so many laws, but it's always implementation and enforcement that's the problem. So in this case, what can the quadcom look into in terms of having a law that would impact implementation? Because even this whole war on drugs, that was the platform that the former President Duterte ran under. And people were convinced that it was needed, which I think what led to his victory. But Filipinos also acknowledge that when it comes to the justice system, mabagal talaga. We don't see results. So when you say, let's leave it to the justice system, then the crime rates go up, and even crimes go unpunished because even the victims have no time to prosecute it, because that costs money, that costs a lot of time. So how do we improve this for everyone else to make sure that there's peace and security, and that there's also due process?
First of all, Attorney Karen, we really need this EJK law because we need to correct the impression that was given by the former president to the public that it is okay to kill, even criminals only. It is never okay to kill. It is never correct to kill because putting law into our hands is not only illegal, it is also immoral. We have to understand that this is a civilized society. We have the rule of law, and instead of putting the law into our hands, let the justice system take its course. And yes, I acknowledge we need to work together para mapabilis ang judicial system natin. And we need here a whole of the government approach. We need the participation of the PNP, the DOJ, and the judiciary, Attorney Karen. We need to work together.
Attorney Chrissy, you work on the ground. What's your take on, is that achievable?
Well, yes, and another thing that which would directly address implementation would be to legislate an automatic investigation system or automatic autopsy system with regard to deaths, especially those under or during police operations. So, to be frank, there's no rule on autopsy. It's optional, which is why some victims of the war on drugs, when confronted, when harassed by the funeraria, so the funeral parlors, they would say, okay, sign this, sign this. It's a waiver, which says nobody should be held liable for the death of my kin. And so that is what has led us to these thousands of killings, but no investigations or no cases.
Okay. I wanted to ask, paano naman, okay, last question, very briefly lang, what about the victims naman ng mga drug addicts or like rapists and, you know, like heinous crimes? How can we make our justice system more responsive?
Well, one, that investigation system would also apply to them. So those killed by the drug addicts, you say petty criminals, their cases would also be investigated, and the police have to produce credible evidence of why they were killed, so that we could address the problem. And to that point, tangentially, we could also look at the drug policy problem. Is there an issue with our drug law now, which is why we have all these people on the streets, even if we have a strong drug law? Sabi nga nila, matindi yung drug law natin eh. So why? So it will help them as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Congresswoman Jinky and Attorney Chrissy. I'm so sad na kulang na tayo sa time, but thank you again for being here today.
Thank you also, Attorney Karen.
Thank you very much.
It has been almost 3 years since former Rodrigo Duterte lost his immunity from suit as president. But during the quadcom hearing, former President Duterte said that he's ready to face the ICC or has challenged anyone to file cases against him in court in relation to his war on drugs. Be timely informed, be insightful of the news. Always stay at the forefront. Join us again tomorrow for meaningful conversations that would help you form an objective personal opinion. This is Attorney Karen Jimeno. Thank you for spending your hour with us.